The village of Pinewood lay nestled deep in the heart of Oregon's untamed wilderness. Surrounded by towering pines and winding rivers, it was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. The village had its own rhythm, slow and steady, untouched by the outside world. In winter, snow blanketed the landscape, making it appear peaceful and serene, but the villagers knew better. There were places even in the small haven where peace never existed. Among the quaint cottages and rolling hills, there stood a house that no one spoke about. A house with a dark past that had become more of a legend than a memory. Samantha Holden had grown up hearing the stories. Every child in Pinewood knew about the old stone house, though most referred to it simply as the house. It had been abandoned for decades, left to rot at the edge of the village, tucked behind an overgrown grove of trees. The house was made of thick, gray stones, covered in ivy, with broken windows that rattled when the wind blew. Even in broad daylight, it seemed to cast a shadow, a looming presence that weighed down on the village. When Samantha was a little girl, she would often play in the fields with her best friend, Lauren, along with her younger sister, Emily, and Emily's friend, Amy. The four of them were inseparable, spending long summer days running through the tall grass, climbing trees, and laughing until the sun set. Yet, there was always one place they never dared venture, the grounds near the house. It wasn't just a child's fear of ghosts that kept them away. The villagers had long whispered about the family who once lived there. The Connolly family had been one of the wealthiest in Pinewood, known for their grand parties and lavish lifestyle. But their wealth came at a cost. Old Man Connolly had been a strange man, reclusive and secretive, and rumors began to spread that he was involved in things no one should meddle with. Dark things. The villagers spoke of curses, spirits, and dark rituals, but no one could ever prove anything. What they did know was that the entire Connolly family had died under mysterious circumstances, one by one, until only Connolly's daughter, Mary, remained. Mary Connolly's death had been the final chapter in the house's tragic history. Her father had passed not long before, leaving her alone in the vast, empty house. It was said that Mary knew she was cursed, that she would meet the same fate as the rest of her family. Before she died, she made an odd request. She wanted to be buried dressed as a bride, even though her husband had died years before. The villagers found it strange, but honored her wish, dressing her in a white gown and veil, and burying her with her family. After Mary's death, the house was abandoned, and no one ever moved in again. The villagers avoided it, and the stories of strange occurrences around the house grew with time. Samantha had lived next to the house for as long as she could remember, but her family never spoke of it. Their own house was just far enough from the overgrown property that they didn't have to see it unless they wanted to. And no one ever wanted to. The house seemed to loom on the edge of their lives, a reminder of something unspeakable. But things changed one autumn when Samantha was 12. She and her sister Emily had been playing in the woods behind their house, running through the fallen leaves, laughing and chasing one another. Lauren and Amy had already gone home for the day, leaving the sisters alone. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, they decided to head home. But the quickest route meant passing by the house. Samantha hesitated as they reached the edge of the property, her eyes lingering on the broken stone wall that surrounded the yard. The once manicured gardens were now wild and overgrown, thorny vines choking the path. The house itself stood like a specter in the fading light, its broken windows like hollow eyes watching them. Emily, always the braver of the two, tugged on Samantha's arm. "Come on, Sam. It's just a house," Emily said, though there was a tremor in her voice. Reluctantly, Samantha followed her sister down the narrow path that led past the house. The air felt colder here, though the day had been warm, and Samantha felt a strange tightness in her chest. She quickened her pace, eager to be past the house and back on the familiar road. But Emily stopped suddenly, her face pale. "Do you feel that?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Samantha felt it too, a sudden drop in temperature, as if they had stepped into a freezer. She looked at her sister, whose lips had turned blue. Emily shivered violently, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's freezing," she said through chattering teeth. Samantha glanced back at the house, feeling the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Something wasn't right. She grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her forward. "Let's go. We'll be home in a minute." They hurried down the path, their footsteps echoing in the silence. As soon as they passed the old cemetery that bordered the house, the chill disappeared as quickly as it had come. Emily stopped shivering, and the color returned to her cheeks. "That was weird," Emily said, rubbing her arms. "It felt like someone walked over my grave." Samantha forced a laugh, though she didn't find it funny. They didn't speak of it again, but the strange encounter haunted Samantha's thoughts for days afterward. 2 nights later, the real terror began. It was just after midnight when Samantha was jolted awake by the sound of Emily screaming. She bolted out of bed and ran down the hall to her sister's room, her heart pounding in her chest. She found Emily sitting up in bed, her face pale and her body trembling uncontrollably. "I'm so cold," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't stop shaking." Their mother rushed into the room, piling blankets on top of Emily, but nothing helped. The room itself was warm. It was late summer after all. But Emily was freezing. Samantha watched helplessly as her sister continued to shiver, her teeth chattering. Their father, who had always been a practical man, stepped into the room, his brow furrowed in concern. He wasn't one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but something about Emily's sudden illness made him uneasy. He whispered something under his breath, an old prayer he had learned from his grandmother, and within minutes, Emily's shivering stopped. She fell into a deep, restless sleep. The next day, Emily seemed fine, as if nothing had happened. But that night, it happened again. And the night after that. Each time, Emily would wake up screaming, complaining of an unbearable cold that no amount of blankets could cure. Their father grew more concerned. He had heard stories from the older villagers, stories about strange happenings near the house, but he had always dismissed them as nonsense. Now, he wasn't so sure. He decided to visit the old priest who had lived in Pinewood for as long as anyone could remember. Father Jacob was an old man, his once black hair now gray and thin. He had seen many strange things in his time, but when Samantha's father told him about Emily's condition, he frowned deeply. "It's not uncommon for the spirits to latch on to the living," Father Jacob said, his voice low, "especially near a place like that." Samantha's father didn't need to ask what the priest meant. Everyone in Pinewood knew about the house. "I'll come by tonight," Father Jacob said, "and see what I can do." That evening, Father Jacob arrived at their home just after sunset. He carried with him a small leather bag filled with items Samantha had never seen before. Strange herbs, a vial of holy water, and a small brass bell. He made his way to Emily's room, where she was sitting on her bed, pale and quiet. Father Jacob knelt beside her, placing a hand on her forehead. "Do you feel anything strange, child?" he asked gently. Emily hesitated, then nodded. "I feel like someone's watching me, all the time." Father Jacob's frown deepened. He whispered a prayer and began sprinkling the holy water around the room. The air grew heavy, and Samantha felt a sudden pressure in her chest, as if the room had shrunk around her. The priest continued to chant, his voice rising and falling in a language Samantha didn't understand. As he rang the brass bell, Emily's eyes fluttered closed, and she fell into a deep sleep. For the first time in days, she slept peacefully, without the chilling cold that had plagued her. Father Jacob stayed late into the night, talking quietly with Samantha's parents. He warned them to keep Emily away from the house and to be vigilant. He suspected that whatever haunted that place had latched on to her when she passed by the cemetery. For several weeks, things returned to normal. Emily no longer woke in the night, and the strange cold that had haunted her disappeared. The family began to relax, believing that Father Jacob's rituals had worked. But the peace was short-lived. One evening, Samantha and Emily were home alone. Their parents had gone to a town meeting, and their cousin, who often stayed with them, had gone to visit friends. It was a quiet, uneventful night until Emily heard the sound of the kitchen window slamming open. Startled, she rushed to the kitchen, expecting to find that the wind had blown it open. But when she got there, she froze. Standing outside, just beyond the window, was a figure. A woman, her face pale and her eyes empty. She was wearing a white dress, and a veil covered her head. The woman's lips curled into a twisted smile, her eyes locked on Emily's. Emily couldn't move, her body frozen in place as the woman stared at her, unblinking. "Samantha?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to pull her sister into the room. Samantha saw her too, the woman in the window, standing perfectly still, smiling that terrible smile. For a moment, neither of them could move. The air felt thick, heavy with dread, and the temperature dropped again. But then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman vanished. Emily and Samantha stood in silence for a long moment, unable to comprehend what they had just seen. Then, without a word, they ran to the phone and called their parents. When their father returned, he found both girls huddled in the living room, pale and shaking. They told him about the woman, about her empty eyes and eerie smile. He didn't need to hear more. He knew who they had seen. The next day, Father Jacob returned to the house. This time, he wasn't alone. He brought with him several other villagers, including an old man named George, who had been friends with the Connolly family many years ago. Together, they entered the house. The air inside was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. Cobwebs hung in every corner, and the windows were covered in grime. But there was something else, a presence, something cold and dark that seemed to watch them as they moved through the house. In the center of the living room, Father Jacob found it, a small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside were old, brittle papers, covered in strange symbols. George recognized them immediately. "Connolly was dabbling in things no man should," George said, his voice shaking. "He trapped spirits here, bound them to this place." Father Jacob nodded, his face grim. He knew what needed to be done. With the help of the other villagers, Father Jacob performed a cleansing ritual, one that would free the spirits trapped within the house. It took hours, and by the time they finished, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the village. As they left the house, Father Jacob turned to Samantha's father. "It's over," he said. "The spirits are free." And it was. The cold that had haunted Emily disappeared, and the strange occurrences stopped. The house was left empty once more, but this time it felt different, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from it. Years passed, and Samantha and Emily grew up. They moved away from Pinewood, leaving the memories of that haunted house behind. But the story of the house remained, passed down through generations, a reminder of the dark things that once lurked in the shadows of their quiet village. And though the spirits had been freed, some villagers still swore they saw a woman in white, standing by the old cemetery, smiling that terrible smile.